Welcome to A Chapter a Day. Support our channel and subscribe today. You've been told your entire life that success is about what you do, the actions you take, the goals you set, the habits you build. But what if that's not the real story? What if the direction of your life is not controlled by your actions, but by something much deeper, something quieter, something you rarely question? Your brain is not just responding to your life. It is shaping it. Every decision you've made, every opportunity you hesitated on, every pattern you've repeated, they weren't random. They were guided by invisible maps inside your mind. Maps that were built over years. Maps you didn't consciously design. Maps that now quietly determine what feels possible and what doesn't. Here's the truth most people never realize. You don't experience reality as it is. You experience reality as your brain predicts it to be. And if those predictions are limited, your life becomes limited. But here's where everything changes. Because the brain is not fixed. It is adaptable. It is rewritable. It is constantly reshaping itself based on what you focus on, what you repeat, and what you believe. Which means something powerful. The life you're living right now is not a final result. It's a reflection of patterns that can be changed. And in this audiobook, you're going to discover how. Not through motivation, not through surface-level advice, but by understanding the actual mechanisms inside your brain that create behavior, identity, and transformation. By the end of this journey, you won't just think differently. You'll see differently. And once you see differently, you can never go back. Chapter 1. Your brain is not designed for success, it's designed for survival. There's something important you need to understand before anything in your life can truly change. Your brain is not designed to make you successful. It's designed to keep you alive. And those two goals are not the same. Because success requires growth. It requires uncertainty. It requires stepping into the unknown. But survival? Survival demands the opposite. It demands predictability, familiarity, control. So when you feel hesitation, when you feel resistance, when you feel that quiet voice telling you to wait, to delay, to stay where you are, most people interpret that as weakness. They tell themselves they are procrastinating. They think they lack discipline. They assume something is wrong with them. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is far more precise. Your brain is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Protect you. Because from your brain's perspective, unfamiliar equals unsafe. And safe always wins. Let that settle for a moment. Because this single realization begins to explain patterns that may have confused you for years. Why you hesitate when opportunities appear. Why you overthink decisions that could move your life forward. Why you return to the same habits, even when you know they are not serving you. It's not because you don't want more. It's because your brain is prioritizing something else. Familiarity. And here's the key phrase you need to remember throughout this entire journey. Your brain protects the familiar, not the optimal. Not what's best for you. Not what will grow you. Not what will expand your life. Only what it recognizes. Only what it has seen before. Now here's where it becomes even more interesting. Because most people assume that fear is triggered by danger. But in reality, fear is often triggered by difference. Something new. Something uncertain. Something that doesn't match the patterns your brain has already stored. Which means this. An opportunity can feel just as threatening as a risk. Think about that. The very thing that could change your life can create the exact same internal reaction as something that could harm you. And if you don't understand this mechanism, You will misinterpret your own signals. You will think, "This doesn't feel right. I'm not ready. Maybe later." When in reality, what you're experiencing is not misalignment. It's unfamiliarity. And this is where most people unknowingly build invisible ceilings in their lives. Not because they lack potential, but because they trust the wrong signal. They trust comfort. They trust familiarity. They trust what feels known, instead of what leads forward. Now pause for a moment. And think about this carefully. How many decisions in your life have been influenced, not by what was possible, but by what felt comfortable? How many times have you delayed something important? Not because it was impossible, but because it felt unfamiliar? Think about the last opportunity you avoided. Really look at it. Was it truly risk? Or was it something else? Was it uncertainty? Or was it simply something your brain hadn't experienced before? This is the moment where awareness begins. Because once you start noticing this pattern, you begin to separate yourself from it. You begin to see hesitation not as truth, but as a signal. And that signal doesn't mean stop. It means, this is new. Now here's where we introduce something that will continue to unfold throughout this audiobook. A pattern that quietly shapes almost every life decision you make. It's what we'll call the curiosity gap loop. And it works like this. Every time you encounter something unfamiliar, your brain creates a gap. A space between what you know and what you don't. And instead of moving toward that gap with curiosity, most people move away from it. They retreat into what feels certain. They close the loop too quickly. They choose explanation over exploration. And in doing that, they unknowingly limit their lives. Because growth exists inside that gap. Opportunity exists inside that gap. Transformation exists inside that gap. But your brain? Your brain wants closure. It wants answers. It wants certainty. It wants resolution. So it pulls you back toward what it already understands. And this is why so many people live in repetition. Not because life lacks opportunities, but because their brain keeps guiding them back to what feels known. The same types of decisions. The same types of environments. The same types of outcomes. Different situations, same patterns. And if you don't interrupt this loop, you don't just repeat actions. You repeat identities. Because every time you choose what's familiar, you reinforce the version of yourself that already exists. And that's the deeper mechanism most people never see. Your behavior is not just creating results. It's reinforcing identity. So when you avoid something unfamiliar, you're not just avoiding a situation. You're confirming a belief about who you are. I'm not ready. I'm not that type of person. This isn't for me. And the more those beliefs repeat, the more real they feel. Until eventually, they don't feel like beliefs at all. They feel like truth. But they are not. They are patterns. And patterns can be changed, but only when they are seen. So here's a simple shift. The next time you feel hesitation, don't immediately obey it. Don't label it as fear. Don't label it as intuition. Just notice it. Observe it. Because the moment you notice a pattern, you begin to weaken its control. You create space between you and the automatic response. And in that space, something powerful becomes possible. Choice. Not reaction. Not habit. Choice. And that is where transformation begins. Now take another moment and ask yourself this. What if the feelings you've been trusting were never designed to guide you towards success, but only to guide you towards safety? What would you do differently? What decisions would you reconsider? What opportunities would you look at again with new awareness? Because once you understand this, you can no longer interpret your hesitation the same way. You begin to see it for what it is. Not a stop sign, but a signal that you're approaching the edge of your current identity. And that edge is exactly where growth begins. So as we move forward, remember this: your brain protects the familiar, not the optimal. And if you follow familiarity, you will stay where you are. But if you learn to move through unfamiliarity, you begin to expand who you are. And that leads us to the next realization. Because if your brain is constantly protecting what it already knows, then it must be doing something else beneath the surface. Something even more powerful. Something that explains why your life patterns repeat, even when you consciously want them to change. It's not just reacting. It's predicting. You've begun to understand why you hesitate and why the familiar feels so powerful. But hesitation is only the surface. Because beneath every decision you make, your brain is running a deeper system. A system that quietly shapes what you see, what you expect, and what you believe is possible. And once you understand this system, you'll begin to see why your life has followed the patterns it has. And more importantly, how to change them. Chapter 2: The Prediction Machine: Why You Keep Repeating the Same Life. There's a deeper layer to everything you experienced in the last chapter. You now understand that your brain is designed for survival, not success. That it protects what's familiar, not what's optimal. But that's only the surface of the mechanism. Because your brain doesn't just react to the world. It predicts it. And once you understand this, something begins to shift. Because the life you think you're responding to is often the life your brain is expecting. Slow down and really take that in. Before you walk into a room, your brain has already formed an expectation. Before you start a conversation, it has already predicted an outcome. Before you take action, it has already simulated what might happen. And here's the part most people never realize. Those predictions are not neutral. They are built from your past experiences, your past emotions, your past interpretations of what things meant. Which means this: you are not seeing reality as it is. You are seeing reality through a filter shaped by everything you've already lived through. And this is the phrase you need to remember. You don't see reality, you see your brain's expectations. Not the opportunity as it truly is. Not the person as they truly are. Not the situation as it fully exists. Only what your brain has learned to expect. And if those expectations are limited, your life begins to reflect those limits. Now here's where this becomes something you can recognize in your own experience. Because once you see this pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. In relationships. Have you ever noticed how people tend to end up in similar types of relationships, again and again? Different person, same dynamic. Different face, same outcome. It's not coincidence. It's prediction. If your brain has learned to expect a certain type of interaction, it will subtly guide your behavior to recreate it. The way you communicate. The way you interpret signals. The way you respond to tension. All of it shaped by what your brain believes is familiar. And because it feels familiar, it feels right, even when it isn't. Now look at careers. How often do people stay within a narrow range of opportunities? Not because that's all that exists, but because that's all they can clearly imagine? They apply for roles that feel like them. They avoid paths that feel too different. They repeat patterns of effort, hesitation, and decision-making. And over time, their results begin to look predictable. Not because life lacks options, but because their brain is filtering those options out. Now look at habits. The routines you fall back into. The behaviors that repeat even when you try to change them. It's not just discipline. It's expectation. If your brain expects you to act a certain way in a certain situation, it will guide you there automatically. Quietly. Consistently. Almost invisibly. And this is what creates the loop. Prediction, behavior, result, reinforced prediction. Over and over again. Until eventually, it feels like your life is just how things are. But it's not. It's how your brain has learned to expect things to be. Now pause here and really think about this. Where in your life do you see repetition? Not surface-level repetition, but deeper patterns. The kind that show up in different forms, but feel strangely familiar. Maybe it's how you respond to challenges. Maybe it's how you approach opportunities. Maybe it's how you talk yourself out of something just before it could change everything. Think about it. Because this is your pattern recognition trigger. The moment where you stop seeing isolated events and start seeing connected patterns. And once you see the pattern, you can no longer pretend it's random. Now here's where things get even more interesting. Because your brain doesn't just predict outcomes. It also tries to confirm them. This is what creates a powerful internal bias. If your brain expects something to fail, it will subtly guide your attention towards signs of failure. If it expects rejection, it will notice every small signal that confirms it. If it expects difficulty, it will amplify obstacles and minimize possibilities. And over time, you begin to feel like your expectations are accurate. Like they are simply reflecting reality. But in truth, they are shaping it. And this is where many people get stuck. Not because they lack intelligence. Not because they lack ability. But because they are trapped inside a prediction loop they've never questioned. They believe their experience is objective, when it's actually filtered, conditioned, constructed. But here's the shift, and it's a powerful one. The moment you notice the pattern, you step outside of it. Let that sink in. Not when you fight it. Not when you try to force change. Not when you criticize yourself. But when you simply notice. Because noticing creates separation. And separation creates choice. When you see the prediction happening, you are no longer fully inside it. You are observing it. And that changes everything. Because now, instead of reacting automatically, you can pause. And in that pause, you can ask a different question. Not, what do I feel like doing? But, what is my brain expecting me to do? And then, what would happen if I did something different? That small shift is the beginning of breaking the loop. Now imagine applying this in real time. You're about to avoid something important. But instead of immediately pulling back, you notice the pattern. You recognize the familiar feeling. You see the prediction forming. And for a moment, you don't follow it. That moment matters more than you think. Because every time you interrupt a prediction, you weaken it. And every time you choose differently, you begin building a new pattern. A new expectation, a new version of reality. But this leads us to something even deeper. Because if your brain is constantly predicting your behavior, then there must be something guiding those predictions. Something more foundational than habits. Something more stable than emotions. Something that determines not just what you do, but what feels natural for you to do. And that something is identity, because your brain doesn't just predict outcomes. It predicts based on who it believes you are. And that belief is shaping everything. You've seen how your brain filters reality, how it builds patterns, how it quietly guides you back to the same outcomes. But those patterns are not random. They are anchored in something deeper. Because your brain is not just predicting actions. It is protecting a version of you. A version that feels familiar. A version that feels consistent. A version it has learned to defend. And once you understand that, you begin to realize something powerful. If you change the identity, you change the predictions. And if you change the predictions, you change your life. Chapter 3: Identity is the code. Change this and everything follows. There is a level deeper than behavior. Deeper than habits. Deeper even than the predictions your brain is constantly making. And that level is identity. Because at the end of the day, your life is not shaped by what you want. It is shaped by who you believe you are. You can want success. You can want change. You can want a different future. But if your identity does not match those desires, your behavior will quietly return you to what feels consistent. This is the invisible force behind everything. And here is the phrase you need to remember. Your life follows the identity you protect. Not the identity you wish for. Not the identity you admire. Not the identity you talk about becoming. The one you protect. The one you reinforce through your daily thoughts, your reactions, your choices. Because identity is not just an idea. It is a system. A control system. And its job is simple. Keep your behavior aligned with who you believe you are. So if somewhere, deep down, you carry the belief, "I'm not the type of person who takes risks," then no matter how many opportunities appear, your behavior will adjust to maintain that belief. If you believe, "I struggle with consistency," then even when you start strong, something will eventually pull you back. Not because you lack discipline, but because your identity is restoring balance. Now this might feel uncomfortable to hear, but stay with it, because this is not a limitation. It's leverage. Once you understand this, you stop fighting your behavior, and you start examining the identity behind it. Now let's make this real. I want you to picture two versions of a person. They are standing in the exact same situation. The same opportunity appears in front of them. One hesitates. The other acts. The one who hesitates begins thinking, "What if this doesn't work? What if I'm not ready? What if I fail?" The one who acts thinks differently. "This could be interesting. I'll figure it out. Let's see what happens." Same opportunity, different response. But here's the important question. Why? What actually caused the difference? It wasn't intelligence. It wasn't resources. It wasn't even confidence. It was identity. One person sees themselves as someone who needs certainty before acting. The other sees themselves as someone who creates clarity through action. Two completely different internal definitions. And those definitions shape everything that follows. Now here's where the mental mirror technique comes in. Because I want you to see yourself in both of these identities. Not as separate people, but as patterns you've already lived. Think about a moment in your life when you hesitated. A real moment. Something that mattered. You felt the pull to act, but something held you back. Now step into that version of yourself. What were you telling yourself? What did you believe about your ability in that moment? What identity were you protecting? Now shift. Think about a moment when you acted decisively. When you moved forward, even without complete certainty. When you trusted yourself, even slightly. Step into that version. What changed? Because something did. And it wasn't the external situation. It was internal. It was how you saw yourself. This is the mirror. Both versions exist within you. The one who hesitates, and the one who acts. The one who doubts, and the one who moves forward anyway. The one who stays familiar, and the one who expands. And your life is shaped by which one you reinforce more often. Now here's the deeper realization. Most people try to change their actions without changing their identity. They set goals. They create plans. They push themselves to behave differently. But underneath it all, their identity remains the same. And eventually, they snap back, not because they failed, but because they returned to alignment. Alignment with who they believe they are. So if you want real change, sustainable change, you don't start with behavior. You start with identity. You start asking a different question. Not, what should I do? But, who am I being when I make this decision? Because that question reveals everything. Now pause for a moment and sit with this. What decisions would you make if you already believed you were capable? Not hoping to be, not trying to be, but already believing it. How would you approach opportunities? How would you handle uncertainty? How would you respond to hesitation? Because here's the truth. Capability often follows belief, not the other way around. The moment you begin to see yourself differently, your brain starts adjusting your behavior to match. And this is where identity becomes a tool. Not something fixed, but something you can shape. Not instantly, but intentionally. Through repetition, through awareness, through small, consistent shifts in how you show up. Because every action you take is a vote for the identity you are building. Every time you act despite hesitation, you reinforce the identity of someone who moves forward. Every time you notice doubt but don't obey it, you reinforce the identity of someone who is not controlled by it. And over time, these small votes accumulate, until one day, the new identity feels natural, not forced, not artificial, just who you are. Now here's something subtle, but powerful. Your brain is always asking, is this consistent with who I believe I am? And if the answer is no, it creates resistance. But if the answer is yes, it creates momentum. So the goal is not to eliminate resistance entirely. The goal is to build an identity that makes the right actions feel natural. And that process begins with awareness. Seeing the old patterns, recognizing the old identity, understanding how it has shaped your life so far. Not judging it, just seeing it clearly. Because the moment you see it, you are no longer fully inside it. And that gives you something powerful. The ability to choose differently. Not all at once, but one decision at a time. One moment at a time. One shift at a time. And each shift moves you closer to a new identity. Now take a breath and ask yourself one more question. What identity have you been protecting that is no longer serving the life you want to build? Because once you answer that honestly, you begin to loosen its grip. And once that grip loosens, something new can emerge. Because if identity shapes behavior, and behavior shapes results, then changing identity changes everything. But this leads us to another realization. Because even when people begin shifting their identity, they often run into something unexpected. Something that makes the process feel confusing. Because the limits they experience don't always come from identity alone. Sometimes, they come from something even more subtle. the way the brain filters reality itself. You've seen how identity shapes your actions, how it controls your behavior, how it quietly defines what feels possible. But what if the limits you feel are not just coming from who you believe you are, but from how your brain is interpreting the world around you? Because even with a new identity, if your perception stays the same, your results will too. So now it's time to look at something even deeper. Not just who you are, but what you believe is possible. Chapter 4: The Illusion of Limits. Your brain filters possibility. There is a moment that changes everything for people. Not when they gain more knowledge, not when they acquire new skills, not even when they discover new opportunities, but when they begin to question something they've always assumed was true: their limits. Because most people move through life believing their limits are real. They believe they are seeing the world clearly. They believe they are evaluating situations objectively. They believe what feels impossible actually is impossible. But what if that isn't true? What if the limits you feel are not external at all? What if they are internal filters shaped by your past? Let's slow this down. Your brain is constantly processing an overwhelming amount of information. Every second, there are more details, possibilities, and signals around you than you could ever consciously handle. So your brain does something essential. It filters. It decides what to focus on and what to ignore, what to highlight and what to remove. And it does this based on one thing: what it already knows, what it has learned to expect, what it has been conditioned to recognize. Which means this: you are not seeing all of reality. You are seeing a selected version of it. A version shaped by your experiences, your beliefs, your identity. And here's the realization that shifts everything. Limits are not always real. They are often filtered. Filtered out before you even notice them. Opportunities you don't consider. Paths you don't explore. Possibilities that never fully enter your awareness. Not because they don't exist, but because your brain doesn't present them to you. Now take a moment and think about this question. How many opportunities might exist around you right now that you simply aren't seeing? Not because they are hidden, but because they don't match your current expectations? This is where we introduce a powerful reframing. And it may feel uncomfortable at first, but stay with it. The problem isn't your potential, it's your perception. Let that land. Because most people spend their lives trying to increase their potential. They want more skills, more confidence, more knowledge. And those things matter. But they miss something deeper. If your perception is limited, you will never fully use your potential. Because you can't act on what you don't see. You can't pursue what doesn't feel possible. You can't move towards something your brain has filtered out. So the real shift is not just becoming more capable. It's becoming more aware of what your brain is excluding. Now let's make this real. Imagine two people. They are given the exact same opportunity, same timing, same conditions, same potential outcome. From the outside, everything is identical. But internally, something very different is happening. The first person looks at the opportunity and thinks, "This is too much. I don't have enough experience. This probably won't work for me." Their brain begins filtering the situation through past experiences. Moments of failure, moments of doubt, moments where things didn't go as planned. And because of that, they don't just see the opportunity. They see risk. They see difficulty. They see reasons to hold back. Now the second person looks at the exact same situation, but their internal response is different. This is interesting. I don't know everything yet, but I can figure it out. This could lead somewhere. Their brain filters the same reality, but through a different lens. Possibility instead of limitation. Curiosity instead of fear. Exploration instead of avoidance. And because of that, they don't just see the opportunity. They see potential. Now here's the key point. The opportunity didn't change. Reality didn't change. Only perception changed. And that difference creates entirely different outcomes. One person hesitates. The other moves forward. One reinforces limitation. The other expands possibility. And over time, these small differences compound until their lives look completely different. Not because one had more potential, but because one perceived more possibility. Now pause here and reflect on your own life. Where have you interpreted something as not for you? Where have you decided something was too difficult or not realistic? Where have you quietly filtered out paths before fully exploring them? Because this is where awareness begins. Not by forcing yourself to think positively, but by recognizing how your perception has been shaping your reality. Now here's something even more subtle. Your brain doesn't just filter based on the past. It also filters based on identity. If you believe you are a certain type of person, your brain will highlight evidence that supports that belief, and it will ignore evidence that contradicts it. So if you believe, "I'm not good at this," your brain will find proof. Moments where you struggled, times where things didn't work, and it will quietly remove everything else. But if you begin shifting that belief, even slightly, your perception begins to change. You start noticing different things, different possibilities, different interpretations, different pathways forward. And this is how change actually begins. Not with massive external shifts, but with subtle internal ones. The way you interpret, the way you notice, the way you allow new possibilities into your awareness. Now here's a question to sit with. What if the limits you've accepted were never real to begin with? What if they were simply interpretations that you repeated long enough to believe? Because once you consider that possibility, something starts to open. You begin to question. You begin to explore. You begin to look at your life differently. And that shift creates space. Space for new ideas, new actions, new outcomes. Because when perception expands, possibility expands. And when possibility expands, so does your life. Now take a breath and let this settle. You are not stuck because of reality. You are stuck because of how reality has been filtered. And the moment you begin to see beyond those filters, you begin to see new paths, new directions, new versions of yourself. But this leads us to something equally important. Because even when people begin to see new possibilities, even when their perception starts to expand, there is still a gap. A gap between seeing what's possible and actually becoming it. And that gap is where many people fall back into old patterns. Because knowing something is possible is not the same as embodying it. And this is where the next principle becomes essential. Because once perception expands, the question becomes, how do you turn that awareness into real, lasting change? You've begun to see that your limits are not fixed, that your perception has been shaping what feels possible, that reality itself has been filtered through your past. And now, something has opened. But awareness alone is not enough. Because seeing possibility does not automatically create transformation. Transformation requires something deeper. Something your brain is already capable of. but most people never fully use. The ability to rewire itself, to adapt, to change, to become something new. Chapter 5: Neuroplasticity, the power you've been underestimating. Up to this point, you've seen something important. Your brain protects what's familiar. It predicts your reality. It filters what you see as possible. It reinforces the identity you've been living in. And if that were the end of the story, change would feel almost impossible, because everything would be locked in place. But this is where something extraordinary comes in. Something most people hear about, but never fully understand. Your brain is not fixed. It is adaptable. It is constantly changing. And more importantly, it is changing based on how you use it. This is what we call neuroplasticity. And while the word might sound technical, the principle is simple. Your brain rewires itself based on repetition and focus. What you think about consistently, what you do repeatedly, what you pay attention to over time, it all leaves a physical imprint. Not metaphorically, literally. Connections in your brain strengthen. Pathways become faster. Patterns become automatic. And this leads us to one of the most important phrases in this entire journey. Neurons that fire together, wire together. Let that settle. Because this is happening all the time. When you repeat a thought, you strengthen that thought. When you repeat a behavior, you make it easier to repeat again. When you reinforce an identity, you make it feel more real. Now pause for a moment. And think about this. Every habit you have, every reaction that feels automatic, every pattern that seems difficult to break, was once something new, something unfamiliar, something that required effort. But over time, through repetition, it became wired. It became easier, faster, more natural, and eventually, it became part of who you are. Now here's the shift. If your brain can wire patterns through repetition, it can also rewire them. Which means this: you are not stuck with the identity you have been living. You are not locked into your past behaviors. You are not permanently defined by your previous patterns. Because your brain is always adapting, always updating, always responding to what you repeat. But here's where most people misunderstand this idea. They think change requires something dramatic, a complete transformation, a sudden breakthrough, a massive shift in behavior. But that's not how the brain works. The brain changes through consistency, not intensity. Let that sink in. Because this is where people lose momentum. They try to change everything at once. They push hard for a short period of time. And when it doesn't immediately feel natural, they assume it's not working. But what's actually happening is that the new pattern hasn't been repeated enough. It hasn't been wired yet. So it still feels unfamiliar. And remember, your brain resists unfamiliarity. Not because it's wrong, but because it's new. Now this is where we introduce something powerful. Something that turns this understanding into a practical process. The identity upgrade loop. And it works like this. Small actions, repeated consistently, create new neural patterns, which reinforce a new identity. Not the other way around. You don't become a new person, and then act differently. You act differently, and then become a new person. Slowly, gradually, but reliably. Now imagine this in your own life. Instead of trying to completely reinvent yourself, you make one small shift. Just one. Something simple. Something repeatable. Something aligned with the identity you want to build. Maybe it's how you respond to hesitation. Instead of immediately pulling back, you take a small step forward. Not a huge leap, just a step. And you repeat that again and again. And over time, that small action begins to feel less unfamiliar, less uncomfortable, more natural. And eventually, it becomes part of your pattern, part of your wiring, part of your identity. Now pause here, because this is where a realization often happens. You don't need massive change. You need consistent direction. Say that again, slowly. You don't need massive change. You need consistent direction. Because direction determines what you repeat. And what you repeat determines what your brain wires. And what your brain wires determines who you become. Now think about how this applies to everything. Confidence. Most people believe confidence is something you either have or don't have. But confidence is built through repeated exposure, through repeated action, through repeatedly showing your brain, I can handle this. At first, it feels uncomfortable, then manageable, then normal, and eventually expected. The same is true for discipline, for focus, for resilience. All of it is built the same way. Repetition, not perfection. Direction, not intensity. Now here's something subtle, but important. Every time you repeat an old pattern, you strengthen it, even if you don't want to, even if you're aware of it, because your brain doesn't judge. It wires. So awareness alone is not enough. You must pair awareness with new repetition, new actions, new responses, even small ones, because every small shift is a vote for a new identity, and every repeated vote makes that identity stronger. Now take a moment and reflect on this question. What is one pattern you've been repeating that is wiring a version of yourself you no longer want to be? And now ask, what is one small shift that would begin wiring something different? Not something overwhelming, not something unrealistic, just something consistent. Because consistency is what your brain responds to. Consistency is what creates change. Consistency is what transforms identity. Now here's the part that changes how you see the process. At first, the new behavior feels like effort. It feels unnatural. It feels like something you have to remember to do. But over time, it becomes automatic. And when it becomes automatic, it becomes identity. You don't have to think about it anymore. You don't have to force it. It's just who you are. And this is how real transformation happens. Quietly, gradually, but permanently. Now take a breath and let this settle. You are not trying to force change. You are training your brain. And your brain learns through repetition. So the question is no longer, how do I change my life overnight? The question becomes, what am I repeating daily that is shaping who I am becoming? Because that answer is your future. Now here's where this leads. Because once you understand that your brain rewires through action, a new realization begins to form. You stop waiting for the perfect feeling. You stop waiting for the perfect moment. You stop waiting to feel ready. Because you see something clearly. Readiness is not what creates action. Action is what creates readiness. And this brings us to a powerful shift. One that challenges a belief almost everyone has carried at some point. The belief that you need to feel confident before you act. But what if that belief is backwards? What if confidence doesn't come first? What if it comes after? You've begun to understand how your brain rewires, how repetition shapes identity, how small actions create lasting change. And now, a new question emerges. If your brain changes through action, Then what role does confidence really play? Because most people are waiting for a feeling that only appears after they move. So now it's time to challenge one of the most common assumptions and replace it with something far more powerful. Chapter 6: Action creates confidence, not the other way around. There is a belief that quietly holds more people back than almost anything else. It sounds reasonable. It feels logical. It even feels responsible. I'll take action when I feel ready. You've probably said it before. Or at least, you've felt it. You told yourself you needed more clarity, more certainty, more confidence. And until that feeling arrived, you waited. But here's the truth that changes everything. Confidence is not what creates action. Action is what creates confidence. Let that settle. Because this reverses the way most people approach their lives. They wait for a feeling that only appears after they move. And as a result, they stay exactly where they are. This is the reframing that most people never fully accept. Waiting for confidence is the fastest way to stay stuck. Not because you're incapable, not because you're not ready, but because you've tied action to a condition that hasn't been met yet. A condition that cannot be met without action. Now think about how this plays out. You consider starting something new. A project, a conversation, a decision that could move your life forward. And almost immediately, your brain asks, do I feel confident enough? And if the answer is no, you pause, you delay, you step back. But what if that question itself is the problem? Because confidence is not a prerequisite. It's a byproduct. It's something your brain builds after repeated exposure, after repeated action, after repeated evidence that you can handle what's in front of you. Now let's slow this down. Think about anything you're confident in today. Something that feels natural. Something you don't hesitate to do. At some point, that was unfamiliar. At some point, you weren't confident. At some point, you didn't feel ready. But you acted anyway. Maybe imperfectly. Maybe uncertainly. Maybe with hesitation. But you moved. And through that movement, your brain gathered evidence. I did this. I handled that. I survived this situation. And over time, that evidence accumulated until confidence emerged. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but gradually, quietly, naturally. Now here's where this becomes powerful. If confidence is built through action, then waiting for it is unnecessary. And more than that, it's limiting, because every time you wait, you delay the very process that creates the feeling you're waiting for. Now pause here and ask yourself this question honestly. What have you been postponing until you feel ready? Take a moment, because something will come to mind. Something specific. Something you've been thinking about. Something that matters. Now look at it differently. Is the hesitation coming from a lack of ability? Or from a lack of exposure? Because those are not the same. A lack of ability means you cannot do it. A lack of exposure means you haven't done it enough yet. And most of the time, it's exposure, not ability. But your brain doesn't distinguish between the two. It simply registers unfamiliarity and labels it as discomfort, and then interprets that discomfort as a signal to stop. But now you know something different. That discomfort is not a stop sign. It's a starting point. Now imagine shifting your approach. Instead of asking, do I feel confident enough? You ask, what small action can I take right now? Not something overwhelming. Not something perfect. just something that moves you forward, even slightly, because that small action begins the process. It starts building evidence. It starts rewiring your brain. It starts reducing the unfamiliarity. And as unfamiliarity decreases, confidence begins to increase. Now here's something subtle, but important. Confidence doesn't come from success. It comes from participation, from showing up, from engaging, from being in the process. Because even when things don't go perfectly, your brain still learns something powerful. I can handle this. And that belief is the foundation of confidence. Now think about how this applies to your life right now. The areas where you feel stuck, the places where you've been waiting, the decisions you've been delaying. What if the solution is not more thinking, but more doing? Not reckless action, not blind movement, but intentional steps, consistent exposure, repeated engagement. Because every time you act, you are teaching your brain something new. And every time you teach your brain something new, you expand what feels possible. Now let's go deeper. There's another layer to this. Because action doesn't just create confidence. It also reshapes identity. Remember this from earlier. Your brain is constantly reinforcing who it believes you are. So when you take action, even small action, you send a signal. I am someone who moves forward. I am someone who engages. I am someone who does not wait. And over time, that signal becomes stronger, more consistent, more believable, until eventually, it becomes identity. Now you're no longer trying to act confidently. You're acting from a place of confidence, because it has been built through repetition. Now take a breath, and consider this. What if you stopped waiting for the feeling, and started trusting the process? What if you allowed action to come first, and let confidence follow? Because that shift changes everything. It removes the barrier. It removes the delay. It removes the illusion that you need to feel a certain way before you begin. And in its place, it gives you something far more powerful: momentum. And momentum is what creates change. Now here's one more realization to sit with. The people you see who appear confident did not start that way. They simply acted more often. They stepped forward more times. They built more evidence. And over time, that evidence became belief. And that belief became identity. So the difference is not who they are. It's what they've repeated. Now bring this back to yourself. You don't need to wait. You don't need to feel ready. You don't need perfect conditions. You need movement. Small, consistent, intentional movement. Because that is what rewires your brain. That is what builds confidence. That is what transforms identity. And once you understand this, you begin to see hesitation differently. Not as something to eliminate, but as something to move through. Because on the other side of action is the version of you that no longer waits. Now let this settle. Confidence is not the starting point. It is the result. And the sooner you act, the sooner it begins to grow. But this leads us to something important. Because even when people start taking action, even when they begin building confidence, they often encounter a new kind of resistance. A deeper one that feels less like hesitation and more like internal tension. Because as you begin to change, your brain begins to react. Not because something is wrong, but because something is different. You've started to see that action creates confidence. That movement builds belief. That waiting is what keeps you stuck. And now, you're stepping forward. But as you do, You may notice something unexpected, a new kind of resistance, not the hesitation from before, but a deeper discomfort, because your brain is adjusting. It's recognizing that something is changing, and it doesn't always welcome that change easily. So now it's time to understand this next layer. Why growth can feel uncomfortable, and why that discomfort is not something to avoid, but something to understand. Chapter 7: The brain resists the new you. At this point, something has started to shift. You've seen how your brain protects the familiar. You've seen how it predicts your reality. You've seen how identity shapes your behavior, and how action begins to rewire it. And maybe you've even started to apply it. Small actions, new decisions, a slightly different way of showing up. But then something happens. Something subtle, but powerful. The moment you begin stepping into a new version of yourself, you feel resistance. Not the kind of hesitation you felt before. Not the surface-level doubt. Something deeper. A kind of internal friction. A discomfort that doesn't quite make sense. Because on one level, you know you're moving in the right direction. But on another level, it feels wrong. Unnatural. Almost like you're stepping outside of who you're supposed to be. And this is where many people get confused. They interpret that feeling as a sign, a warning, a signal that something is off. So they pull back. They return to what feels normal. They settle back into the familiar version of themselves. And the change stops. But here's what's really happening. And this changes everything. Your brain is resisting the new you. Not because the new you is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. And unfamiliar, to your brain, means potential threat. Let that sink in. Because this is not a flaw. It's a function. Your brain has one primary goal. Maintain stability. Maintain consistency. Maintain the identity it has learned to recognize as you. So when you begin acting differently, thinking differently, choosing differently, your brain doesn't immediately celebrate. It reacts. It tightens. It questions. It creates discomfort. Because from its perspective, something important is changing. Now here's the shift. That discomfort you feel is not a warning. It's a transition. And this is the phrase you need to remember. Discomfort is not a warning, it's evidence of expansion. Say it again, slowly. Because this is where people either grow or return to where they started. When discomfort appears, you have two choices. You can interpret it as danger, or you can recognize it as growth. Now let's go deeper. There's a reason success can feel unnatural at first. There's a reason new behaviors feel awkward. There's a reason stepping into a new identity feels off. It's because your brain hasn't closed the loop yet. Remember the curiosity gap loop. That space between what is known and what is new. When you step into a new version of yourself, you enter that gap. And your brain immediately wants to close it. It wants to return you to certainty, to familiarity, to the version of you it already understands. So it creates pressure, internal pressure. Thoughts like, this isn't really you. You're forcing it. This won't last. But those thoughts are not truth. They are protection. They are your brain trying to restore the previous pattern. Now imagine this in a real moment. You begin speaking up more. Where you used to stay quiet. You begin taking action more quickly. Where you used to hesitate. You begin making decisions with more certainty. Where you used to overthink. And suddenly, it feels strange, unnatural, even uncomfortable. And the temptation is to stop, to go back, to return to the version of yourself that feels easier. But here's the key. That easier version is not better. It's just more familiar. Now pause here and think about a moment in your life where you grew. Something that once felt uncomfortable, but now feels normal. At some point, you experienced this exact process. The discomfort, the resistance, the unfamiliarity, but you stayed with it long enough for your brain to adapt, long enough for the new pattern to wire, long enough for the new identity to stabilize. And eventually, what once felt unnatural became natural. This is how all growth works. Not instantly, not effortlessly, but through repeated exposure to what initially feels unfamiliar. Now here's the deeper realization. The discomfort you feel is not random. It is directly proportional to the level of change you are creating. The more you stretch beyond your current identity, the more your brain reacts, the more it tries to pull you back, which means something powerful. The presence of discomfort is actually a signal of progress. Now that doesn't mean all discomfort should be followed blindly, but in the context of growth, in the context of becoming something more, it is often the exact place you need to move through, not around, through. Now take a moment and reflect on this question. Where in your life are you experiencing discomfort right now? That might actually be growth? Not something to avoid, but something to understand. Because once you reframe it, your entire relationship with change shifts. You stop fearing the feeling. You start expecting it, even welcoming it, because you recognize what it represents. Expansion. Now here's where this becomes practical. The next time you feel that internal resistance, don't immediately react. Don't pull back. Just notice it. Label it. This is unfamiliar. Not, this is wrong. Because that small shift keeps you moving forward. It keeps you inside the process. It keeps you from collapsing back into the old identity. And over time, something begins to happen. The discomfort decreases. The resistance softens. The new behavior starts to feel more natural. And eventually, it becomes part of you. Not something you're trying to do, but something you simply are. Now take a breath and let this settle. You are not failing when it feels uncomfortable. You are expanding. You are not off track when it feels unfamiliar. You are rewiring. You are not becoming someone fake. You are becoming someone new. And that process will always feel different at first. But if you stay with it, if you continue moving through the discomfort, if you allow the new identity to take root, something powerful happens. The version of you that once felt unnatural becomes your new normal. And when that happens, your life begins to change in ways that once felt impossible. But this leads us to something even more fundamental. Because all of this, the patterns, the identity, the action, the discomfort, is being shaped by something you are using every single moment. Something so constant that you rarely question it. Your attention. Because where your attention goes, your brain follows. And what your brain follows, it strengthens. So now it's time to look at one of the most powerful forces in your life. Something that quietly determines what grows and what fades. You've begun to understand that discomfort is part of growth. That resistance is part of change. That becoming someone new requires moving through unfamiliar territory. But there is something guiding all of it. Something directing what your brain focuses on, what it reinforces, and what it turns into reality. Because even as you grow, even as you change, Your attention is shaping the process. And if you don't control your attention, it will control you. So now it's time to understand how this works and how to use it. Chapter 8. Attention shapes reality. What you focus on grows. There is something you are using right now, without thinking about it, without questioning it, without fully realizing its impact. Your attention. It moves constantly, from thought to thought, from idea to idea, from one detail to the next. And most of the time, it feels automatic, like it's just happening. But here's the truth. Your attention is not neutral. It is shaping your brain, moment by moment, day by day, pattern by pattern. Because whatever you focus on, you strengthen. Whatever you return to, you reinforce. Whatever you repeatedly notice, you train your brain to prioritize. And over time, this becomes your reality. Now slow down and really take that in. Because this is not just a philosophical idea. It's a neurological process. Your brain is constantly reorganizing itself based on what receives your attention. It's deciding, this matters. This is important. This should be easier to access next time. And it does that by strengthening certain pathways and weakening others. Which means this: your attention is literally rewiring your brain's structure and priorities. Not occasionally, constantly. Now here's where this becomes something you can recognize. Think about how easy it is to focus on certain types of thoughts. Negative ones, doubts, worries, past mistakes. For many people, those thoughts feel automatic. They appear quickly. They repeat often. They hold attention easily. But that's not random. It's trained. Because every time you focus on a negative thought, even briefly, you strengthen the pathway associated with it. You make it easier to access next time. And over time, it becomes your default. Now here's the pattern recognition trigger. Look at the patterns in your life. Not just what happens, but what you focus on within what happens. When something goes wrong, do you replay it? Do you analyze it repeatedly? Do you carry it forward into the next situation? And when something goes right, do you move past it quickly? Do you dismiss it? Do you give it less attention? If so, your brain is learning something very specific. It's learning that negative experiences matter more, that they deserve more focus, more processing, more reinforcement. And as a result, it begins to highlight them more often. Not because your life is more negative, but because your attention is trained to find it. Now this is where things begin to shift. Because once you see this pattern, you realize something powerful. Your attention is not just observing your life. It is shaping it. Now let's go deeper. Your attention doesn't just influence your thoughts. It influences your emotions, your decisions, your identity. Because what you focus on consistently becomes part of how you see yourself. If your attention is constantly drawn to what's not working, you begin to feel like things don't work. If your attention is constantly drawn to your mistakes, you begin to feel defined by them. If your attention is constantly drawn to what's missing, you begin to feel like you're lacking. But if your attention shifts, even slightly, your experience begins to shift with it. Now this doesn't mean ignoring reality. It doesn't mean pretending everything is positive. It means becoming intentional. It means recognizing that your focus is a tool, not just a reaction. Now pause for a moment and ask yourself this question honestly. Where is your attention training your brain right now? Not where you want it to be, Not where you think it should be, but where it actually is. Because that answer is shaping your future. Now imagine this. Two people experience the same situation. A challenge, a setback, something unexpected. The first person focuses on what went wrong. They replay it. They analyze it. They reinforce it. The second person acknowledges it, but then shifts focus. What can I learn? What can I do differently? What's still possible? Same situation, different attention, and over time, that difference compounds. One person trains their brain to see problems. The other trains their brain to see possibilities. One reinforces limitation. The other reinforces growth. And eventually, their realities begin to look completely different. Not because of what happened, but because of what they focused on. Now here's something subtle, but critical. Your brain does not care whether something is helpful or harmful. It only cares whether it is repeated. So if you repeatedly focus on something, it assumes it is important, and it makes it easier to access. Which means this: if you don't direct your attention, your habits will, your past will, your environment will, and over time, they will shape your mind without you realizing it. But the moment you become aware of this, you regain control. Not complete control, but enough to begin changing direction. Now here's a simple shift you can begin using. The next time your attention locks onto something negative, don't force it away. Don't fight it. Just notice it, acknowledge it, and then gently redirect. Not perfectly, not instantly, just intentionally, because redirection is a skill. And like any skill, it strengthens with repetition. Now imagine what happens over time. Instead of reinforcing the same negative patterns, you begin reinforcing different ones. You begin noticing opportunities more often. You begin focusing on solutions more naturally. You begin seeing possibilities more clearly. And slowly, your brain adapts. It rewires. It begins to expect those patterns instead. Now this connects back to everything you've learned so far. Your brain protects the familiar. It predicts based on the past. It reinforces identity. It adapts through repetition. And your attention is what directs all of it. So if you change your attention, you begin changing everything else. Now take a breath and let this settle. You are training your brain, whether you realize it or not. The question is not if it's happening. The question is how. And once you become aware of that, you begin to take ownership. Not perfectly, but intentionally. And that intention creates change. Now here's where this leads. Because even when people begin shifting their attention, even when they start focusing differently, there is still something deeper influencing the process. Something that runs continuously, beneath attention itself. Something that shapes how you interpret everything you focus on. Your internal narrative. The voice in your mind. Because attention determines what you see, but your narrative determines what it means. You've started to see how your attention shapes your reality, how focus rewires your brain, how what you repeat becomes what feels true. But there is something interpreting all of it, something giving meaning to what you focus on. Because two people can focus on the same thing and walk away with completely different conclusions. And that difference comes from the story they tell themselves. So now it's time to look at the next layer. The one that quietly defines how you experience everything. Chapter 9. Rewriting the Inner Narrative. Every day, you are listening to a voice that speaks constantly. A voice that comments on your life. A voice that interprets your experiences. A voice that decides what matters and what doesn't. And here's the thing, most people don't even notice it. They assume it's neutral. They assume it's factual. They assume it is them. But that voice is not neutral. It is not fixed. It is not you. It is a narrative. A story your mind tells itself about who you are, what you can do, and what is possible. And this story, your inner narrative, shapes everything. Not just your thoughts. Not just your decisions. But your behavior. Your identity. The trajectory of your life. Think about it. If your inner voice constantly says, "I'm not ready, I can't do this, I'll fail," what happens? You hesitate. You self-sabotage. You retreat. And over time, your life reflects those repeated messages. Now let's apply the mental mirror technique. Picture two people. The first person faces a challenge. Their inner voice says, "You'll never figure this out. You're not enough. This is too hard." The second person faces the same challenge. Their inner voice says, "This is difficult, but I've learned before. I can figure it out. I will grow." Same circumstance. Same opportunity. Two completely different realities. Because the internal narrative determines interpretation. It filters perception. It programs the brain to expect either limitation or possibility. Here's the critical insight. You don't have to be controlled by the story your mind repeats. You can rewrite it. You can change the voice. And when you change the voice, you change the direction of your life. Let's pause for reflection. Listen closely. What is your inner voice saying right now? Is it supportive? Encouraging? Empowering? Or is it critical, limiting, and protective of the familiar? Notice it. Acknowledge it. But don't argue with it yet. Because argument is not the point. Awareness is. Now imagine this. You take that voice and you start guiding it. Not with force. Not with denial. But with intentional phrasing. You replace "I can't" with "I'm learning how." You replace "This is impossible" with "This is unfamiliar, but possible." You replace "I'm not ready" with "I am becoming ready" with each step. Notice how subtly the mind begins to shift. Notice how the brain begins to recognize a new pattern. A pattern of possibility. A pattern of confidence. A pattern of growth. Because your brain treats repeated statements, your internal dialogue, as reality. The more you reinforce an empowering narrative, the more your brain rewires itself to believe it. The more your brain believes it, the more your behavior aligns with it. And the more your behavior aligns with it, the more your life reflects it. This is the identity upgrade loop in action. Small shifts in your internal story create cascading changes in identity, decisions, and results. Now here's a practical way to begin. Catch the destructive voice. Acknowledge it without judgment. Replace it with a statement that empowers action. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be immediate. It just has to start. Because each repetition strengthens the new pathways. Each repetition reinforces the new story. And each repetition reshapes your identity. Now, take a moment and reflect. What is one recurring story in your mind that you are ready to rewrite? And how will you phrase it differently starting today? Remember, changing the voice changes the direction. This is the bridge between thought and action. Between perception and reality. Between hesitation and momentum. Your brain is listening. Your mind is listening. Your life is listening. And when you consciously guide that inner narrative, You begin to choose the life you want instead of unconsciously repeating the life you've known. You've seen how internal dialogue directs behavior, how attention and narrative shape reality, and how identity rewires itself when reinforced consciously. But now it's time to take a step back to see the bigger picture. Because all the techniques, all the insights, all the rewiring we've explored are part of something larger, something intentional, something deliberate. The ultimate step is not just changing thoughts, or beliefs, or attention. It's designing your life from the vantage point of the new you. Chapter 10. Becoming the architect of your mind. By now, you have traveled a long path. You've explored how your brain protects the familiar. You've seen how it predicts the world based on past experiences. You've discovered that identity controls behavior. You've learned that action precedes confidence. You've realized that discomfort signals growth. You've understood that attention shapes reality. And you've begun rewriting the inner narrative that quietly directs your life. All of these steps are not separate. They are connected. They are part of one overarching truth. You are not bound by the patterns of your past. You are not locked into the identity you once believed you had. You are not a passenger in the life you've been living. You are the designer. You are the architect. Every thought you focus on, every choice you make, every habit you reinforce, every internal story you tell yourself, these are your tools. And the moment you recognize this, something remarkable happens. You see that your brain is not a fixed instrument. It is a malleable one, a living system that can be shaped, refined, and directed. You begin to approach life intentionally, not reactively, not passively, but deliberately, because you now understand how the pieces fit together. Your attention trains your brain. Your internal narrative programs your identity. Your actions build confidence and expand capacity. Your habits strengthen the future version of yourself. This is the identity upgrade loop in motion. Small, consistent, intentional choices accumulate. Over time, they create a version of you that feels inevitable. And here is a truth that most people never fully grasp. The moment you realize your brain is adaptable, your life becomes intentional. Every decision becomes meaningful. Every action becomes a vote for the person you are becoming. Every day is an opportunity to reinforce a life aligned with your highest potential. Now slow down and imagine this. You wake up tomorrow and make one small choice intentionally. Perhaps it's a thought you nurture. Perhaps it's a conversation you engage in differently. Perhaps it's an action you take that feels unfamiliar. You make that choice deliberately, and you do it again the next day, and the next, without judgment, without pressure, but with consistency. And over weeks, months, years, those small choices compound. They transform your habits. They transform your identity. They transform your life. Because you are no longer at the mercy of old patterns. You are no longer defined by past limitations. You are the architect, and your mind is your blueprint. Now let's bring it all together. Everything you've learned in this audiobook, attention, identity, action, narrative, discomfort, neuroplasticity, points to one principle. Your life is the result of what your brain has been trained to do. And if your brain can be trained, you can choose what it learns next. You can choose which habits to reinforce. You can choose which stories to tell yourself. You can choose where your attention goes. You can choose which actions to take. All of it is under your design. And that is the ultimate freedom. Not freedom from circumstances. Not freedom from challenge. But freedom to direct your mind intentionally. Pause here for a moment and reflect. What version of yourself could you create if every choice you made reinforced it? What reality could you build if every thought, every action, every attention, every narrative aligned with who you want to become? That is the power of becoming the architect of your mind. It is not theoretical. It is not abstract. It is practical. It starts now, in this moment. One deliberate thought, one deliberate action, one deliberate choice at a time. Because this is how transformation becomes permanent. This is how change becomes identity. This is how potential becomes reality. And now, with everything you've learned, you are ready to step forward with clarity. Not as someone who hopes to grow. Not as someone who wishes things were different. But as someone who knows. You can design your life. You can direct your mind. You can shape your destiny. You have become aware. You have begun shaping your identity. You have learned the mechanics of change. And now, it's time to integrate it fully. To take all the lessons, all the practices, all the insights, and carry them into your life, deliberately, consistently, and intentionally. In closing, at some point during this journey, something shifted. Maybe it was subtle. A thought that felt different. A realization you couldn't ignore. A moment where you saw your own patterns more clearly than ever before. And that moment matters more than you think. Because change doesn't begin with action. It begins with awareness. You've seen the patterns. You've understood the mechanisms. You've recognized the identity loops shaping your life. And now, you're standing at a decision point. Not a dramatic one. Not a visible one. But one of the most important decisions you will ever make. Will you continue reinforcing the version of yourself you've been? Or will you start building the version of yourself you've just discovered is possible? Because your brain is always listening. Every thought you repeat, every action you take, every pattern you allow, it's all being recorded, reinforced, strengthened. So here's the challenge. The next time you hesitate, notice it. The next time you doubt yourself, observe it. The next time you feel resistance, lean into it. Not because it's easy, but because that's where change begins. Remember this. You are not locked into your past. You are not defined by your habits. You are not limited by your previous identity. You are shaping your brain. And your brain is shaping your life. So start shaping it, intentionally. And once you do, you won't just live differently. You'll become someone entirely new.